The residents of Kiev actually reported just watching these drones come overhead completely unmolested and then strike again and again, one after another drone. Now, drones in general are easier to hit than missiles. They travel much more slowly. Though that's not true when it comes to Patriot systems. Patriot systems are good at hitting ballistic missiles. They're not. There's nothing's perfect, nothing's fail safe, but they're good. That's really what they were developed for, was as a defense system against ballistic missiles. But they're not very good at all. They really can't deal with low flying, slow flying drones. Kiev would be the one city where you're going to see the most, the best air defense within Ukraine. And there seems to be very little air defense left. The reports are, of course, that even the air defense systems, the batteries that remain, are generally without interceptors. They run out. And, I know Zelensky's been demanding more interceptors. And the Americans, like I think I heard Marco Rubio say just a couple of days ago, that we don't have them. And that's a fact. Even before the Ukraine war began, we were low on Patriot interceptors. And then for these other European systems, apparently, the Ukrainians have these batteries, but they're just empty. And so, they're just completely exposed. And if that's true in Kiev, it's going to be doubly and triply true in other cities.
So we just don't have any. We're just supplying month-to-month production to Ukraine with Patriot missiles, interceptors. Is that where we're at right now?
I would think so. We have to maintain a stockpile of some kind, for our own defense needs. I would hope that that's what we're doing, and that's what the Pentagon says they're doing. The last I heard, the U.S. is able to produce 550 interceptors a year, and that's not very much. Well, imagine that you gave all 550 of those to Ukraine, which is not what's going to happen. Some of them are going to be kept by the U.S. and some are going to go to Israel and, other places. But even if you, for the sake of argument, gave all 550 to Ukraine, remember that generally 2 missiles on the average, they're $4 million on the average, are fired for each incoming missile. And so you have maybe 275 missiles come in. You got to fire your full complement of interceptors, and that's it. And then you got to wait another year. It's just not going to work, is it?
Yeah, it's but when the Ukrainians are firing drones and missiles, I guess they don't do missiles so much. There are a few ATACMS into Russia. Are they disabling them mostly through electronic warfare, or are they firing interceptors as well? Because interceptors are expensive. You think that the strategy you would adopt immediately is what we're seeing, what we saw Iran do with Israel, and what we're seeing Russia do with Ukraine, is you attrit. You fire cheap missiles and drones at your opponent, and then they waste all these very expensive interceptor missiles that have a limited production capacity, limited supply. Why isn't the other side? Why isn't Ukraine able to do that? Why can't the Western side even do this? Seems like they're not able to.
Yeah, they may be trying. You would think, because they have been sending lots and lots of drones into Russian territory, and they're getting shot down. 99% of them are. I don't think that's much of an exaggeration. But yeah, the Russian they have a different what would you call it? Just sort of a portfolio, or air defense arsenal with. And I really should get back up up to speed on it. But I know that they use a combination of measures. There's EW, of course, which they're very good at. So a certain percentage are brought down that way, and that doesn't cost them anything. It's just the electric bill. And then there are also systems that are actually fire, I think, large caliber bullets, and and then there are systems, air defense systems that are actually specially designed for dealing with drones, and so they do fire some kind of missile. But I guess I'm just assuming, I need to look into this. Now that you mention it, that's something I need to research. But I'm assuming that those missiles are much cheaper and easier to produce. They're not like the Patriot missiles, $4 million each, which aren't even very good at all against drones.
Okay, so let's say, imagine if you're a country and you are wanting to shop the global arms market to bolster your military, your defense. Where would you go for air defense systems? Would you buy the Patriot for any situation?
I think it's clearly that the S-400 would be a better choice. And that's why we had Turkey, even though it's a NATO country, decided to get S-400 systems, which infuriated the Americans, but that's what they did.
Can a NATO country do that? I mean, wouldn't the NATO be able to? But then wouldn't the U.S. send, oh, great, now we got this S-400 system, we can copy and replicate it. You think that's something that's kind of proprietary that they wouldn't want to give to NATO?
I don't know exactly what arrangement. Obviously the Russians thought this all out ahead of time, but I don't know. Actually, what the reason that the Americans gave for penalizing the Turks for buying the system is that the S-400s would be able to collect data on their F-35s, other American planes. And so I guess the Russians are running these systems or something. I don't know. That's an interesting question. But it was the Americans that were infuriated about it, and they were afraid of, intelligence leaks. The big advantage that the S-400 has or at least one of them is over the Patriots, is that it deals with the full range of air threats. Again, I said the Patriot is really focused on ballistic missiles, but the S-400 can deal with everything from the slowest moving drone up to I don't know about hypersonic missiles, but certainly supersonic ballistic missiles and high altitude missiles. It can deal with a whole range of altitudes and speeds. And the Patriot can't do that. So that is a definite advantage that the S-400 has.
Okay, so you would buy the S-400 aircraft. What about missile defense or air defense?
Right, and that the S-500 is in development, but I think it's going to be put into operation soon. The S-500 takes it even farther. It would be able to shoot down satellites as well. That's so that's the advantage of these Russian systems. They're for the full spectrum of air threats.
Okay, well, what about aircraft? Where would you buy aircraft if you were going shopping?
I really don't know enough about it. I'll be honest with you. I can't. I really don't know. I guess both the Americans and the Russians are, they've developed fifth generation.
Or the Chinese shooting down Rafale jets at $40 million an aircraft opposed to 200 million, right? I mean,
yeah, at least 200 or maybe 180 million, something like that. Okay, I know. We've talked about that earlier. So yeah, that was definitely a good, let's say, sales demonstration, by the Chinese. Again, it maybe wasn't entirely fair because it was just a brief skirmish. Or it's more than a skirmish. It clearly was. But I think to understand a system's capability, you need to follow it over the course of a war that lasts more than just a few days. But yeah, it's suggestive. I mean, it's very suggestive. Yeah, and that Chinese system, which is the J-10C, is actually an older system which they have put out of service within China. But it did very well. And again, it did very well. I think part of the reason is that it's part of an integrated system. The Pakistanis bought the whole Chinese package, everything from radar stations, air defense, the planes, the missiles, they're all Chinese and they're integrated. They work with each other. And that makes them, much more effective.
Right. Kind of what I'm getting at with these questions is that I think now we're at this point where countries are going to realize that the U.S. NATO military industrial complex is a paper tiger this whole time. Well, prior 5 years ago, if you're on the global arms market, I think everybody would be running to the U.S. stall and looking at all their fancy weapons. But right now, it just feels like, okay, air defense, aircraft, missiles, artillery, literally anything. It's like I wouldn't buy American anymore. I feel like that's going to be one of the outcomes of this war, and just I don't understand. I don't know how the U.S. military industrial complex can survive after this war. But it's such a huge part of the United States. It's like if we lose that, the U.S. doesn't export anything at this point. You
Yeah,
know?
no, it's right. It's not just a matter of military prestige. Yeah, there are real economic consequences because, of course, our arms industry is a big part of our economy. And so, yeah, the failure by the Patriot system or whatever, that has huge economic repercussions. So I think there's always, a huge kind of information war. And whenever there's an embarrassment, let's say on the American side, there's a huge effort to spin it, cover it up, or maybe to play up an apparent failure on the Russian side. I mean, that's because billions and billions of dollars are at stake. It's not. Don't pretend that you're going to get just objective reports. There's going to be a real effort to spin every incident that involves these systems.
Right, definitely. Well, since this, you saw that clip with Trump, do you think Trump has really changed his stance now in regards to Russia, or should we not even talk about it? He'll switch his mind.
Yeah, I think it's almost a mistake to talk too much about it. He'll change his mind again. He seemed to again when that other reporter mentioned the so-called assassination attempt. Whether or not it was assassination attempt, you could at least claim that it was. He said, "Oh, well, maybe that explains it." So maybe he sees on that as an excuse, and then he'll continue to have a friendly attitude towards the Russians for a while. But again, there's a lot coming up. I think that there clearly is going to be, well, I won't say clearly because we never know for sure, but there is in all likelihood going to be a major offensive that will start in the next few weeks by the Russians. And then again, you can imagine the news reports on BBC and Fox News and whatever. It's all they're going to play it up, and Trump will probably be sitting in front of the TV watching that and say, "Oh my God, what's Vlad doing? He's gone completely crazy," and we'll be back to where we were just a few hours ago, or was it yesterday? And worse, that's the thing. And, actually, the most worrying thing that I've heard recently is this came from the mouth of Merz, the German chancellor. He said that all restrictions had been lifted on missiles supplied by the UK, the US, France, and Germany. So I suppose that he's talking about, the restrictions that had been reimposed on ATACMS, when Trump took office. That seems to be, he didn't quite say that, but that seemed to be what he was saying. And we'll see if those attacks resume, then we know we're in real trouble. And it's not just that Trump was emotionally, upset, but there has been a real change, a reversion to the bad old policies.
Well, with the ATACMS, how's it work with if this is a U.S. missile? Can the U.S. say don't use ATACMS, but then the Brits are like, you can use our Storm Shadows, or the Germans can say use our Taurus? Like, does each country have its own rules on its weapons and how they can be used in the Ukraine war? And then
Now, well, I've heard that interestingly in the case of the Storm Shadow and the Scalp. And the Scalp is basically the French version of the Storm Shadow. That actually Americans have to be involved in the operation of those missiles as well. Mm. And so if the Americans say no, then okay, those aren't used. Now the Taurus, we had been led to believe earlier that Merz had backed off on that, but maybe not. Merz is really crazy. I find the guy, genuinely frightening. And he may have pushed, and maybe now Germany will start supplying Taurus missiles and allowing them to be fired into pre-2014 Russian territory, which would be a very serious escalation. The Taurus has a much longer range than the other missiles. The ATACMS, the Scalps, and the Storm Shadows. I believe they all have about 300 kilometers. but the Taurus is 500 kilometers, so it could at least, reach the outskirts of Moscow.
Yeah, I have been seeing a renewed campaign online of release the Taurus. I've been seeing people
Yeah.
pushing that, like it Mertz, it's time to step up, and defend against the Russian aggression, the invaders. So I am seeing that. So you think that might actually happen? And then,
Well, it might. Well, that was one place where Schultz, interestingly, Schultz caved in on everything. He said, "Oh no, we can't do that," and then Schultz, the human worm, would always, 3 weeks later say, "Well, I guess we got to do that," you know. But the one exception, the one place where he still had a backbone, was on the Taurus, and it may be that it was just the intelligence that had been provided to him. And I think like when Mertz was taking office, there was, I don't think it was Schultz, but somebody else was saying, well, when Mertz hears about, he gets briefed on the Taurus, I'm sure that he won't do it. So there hasn't been an official announcement, but his recent statement was very suggestive, and he clearly wants to. But I think like within Germany, within the German defense establishment, there is some real resistance to it. We'll see what happens. But that would be a very serious escalation if the Taurus, is introduced into the war. Again, because as the German generals themselves, we had that recording that was leaked by the Russians. So the German generals, they were talking about using the Taurus. It has to be done, with, NATO participation. This is the serious matter. Again, in the mainstream news, you almost never get this. Why can't the Ukrainians fire into Russian territory? The Russians are always firing into Ukrainian territory because it's not the Ukrainians. It would be the Germans, the French, the Americans, that are doing this. And so it becomes an attack by the Americans, by the Germans, whatever, on Russia. And that's just clearly a very serious escalation.
do you think the Russians are scared of the Taurus at all, or it doesn't?
I don't know that they're scared of it. Again, they've had great success. That's one of the things. I think one of the reasons why the ATACMS escalation, when Biden removed the restrictions on the ATACMS and began firing them into Russia last fall. Okay, we did have one, clear response to that, and that was the Oreshkin, right? Oreshnik. Yeah, I knew I got that reversed. The Oreshnik attack. They say, hey, look, this is, if you do this, we do that. But then after that, there really wasn't much, to be honest. And I think it was because, again, they knew that Trump was coming. Trump had won the election, and Trump signaled that he would end, this policy. And he did, and so far as we know, he still has, it's just, he is not allowing so far. But again, the statement by Mertz causes us to worry. But anyway, I was just saying that one reason that the Russians have been reluctant to retaliate in a significant way, or have not, I should put it this way, have not felt pressured to retaliate, is that they've actually been very successful in neutralizing, these threats like the ATACMS. So we have the ATACMS will fire, 6 ATACMS missiles, and all 6 of them are shot down. Now one or two did get through and killed some Russians. That's happened. But in general, the Russians have been very, very successful in neutralizing the ATACMS threat. And I think the same thing will happen with Taurus. Maybe initially, especially at the beginning, when it's a new weapon that's been introduced and the Russians don't have a profile on it. Some of those first strikes might do some real damage. But inevitably, as we've seen in all the other cases, like the Storm Shadow and the Scalp, the Russians will build up a profile, and they'll learn how to neutralize it so that it, you never can neutralize anything 100%, but they can neutralize it 70, 80, 90%. And, reduce the threat. But still, no matter what, it's an escalation. It is an attack by Germany on Russia. And it does put pressure on Putin to retaliate.
Mm. The way that the West has been engaging in this proxy war has been so damaging to NATO's strength in itself, because they've been piecemealing all of these weapons.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you. Yeah, I don't know what
Okay.
happened. You went mute for a few seconds there.
Okay, I was just saying that the way that the West has been engaging in this war with Russia has been really damaging to NATO, its military strength, because they've been piecemealing these weapons one at a time, and we've seen Russia just be able to learn how to adapt to each one as it comes out. It's like, okay, you're rolling out the ATACMS. We'll spend a couple of weeks. Okay, we got it. All right, great. Next, send out the Abrams. Okay, we've captured a few. We inspected. We know all their weak points, how to hit them with drones, disable them. Great. Next. And so it's one at a time. And now basically everything that NATO has, Russia's been able to disable the Excalibur artillery shells, F-16s, whatever it is,
Right.
the Patriot systems, literally every system that they've sent, they've been
Right.
able to inspect and destroy and neutralize. And so it's going to happen the same thing with the Taurus. Maybe you get one or two in, and then they figure out, okay, establish a profile. It's probably going to be quicker for them now because they've had so much practice with all the previous Western military equipment, that this is just another example of just throwing a product into this war where Russia's going to learn how to neutralize it, makes Russia more powerful, and it's completely rendered this military product worthless on the global market. Who wants to buy Tauruses now when the Russians like, here, you can download our
Anti-Taurus.
anti-Taurus patch for $9.95 a month, no problem. It's so just
Right.
the whole strategy behind it's so stupid.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. So now, when the Russians market an S-400 system,
Right. Add
they can
another.
just do that with, including, anti-HIMARS, ATACMS, and now, Taurus, whatever.
Right. Right. Basically anything that the West has. So, yeah, it's something that I come to this realization every now and then, like, my God, the U.S. military-industrial complex is done for because of the way how they handled this Ukraine war. It was, they could have, the possibility if they flooded everything at once, you could have had this initial advantage. They wouldn't be able to neutralize all these things in time, and it could really do some damage.
Right.
But just the way that this is rolled out, the way we've handled everything, I think it just can't be understated how damaging this has been to the U.S. military industrial complex. I personally think it's a death knell. It might take a little while for people to come to that realization. But if you have a country with a military budget, say we got $1 billion to spend, who's going to spend it on U.S. equipment? I just don't.
Yeah, well, of course, the Saudis just bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. equipment. But that may have been more of a,
To placate.
political rather than, actually hard-headed military investment. I think that's probably true. They wanted to make Trump happy, keep on his good side. And, quite possibly, if you look at these packages, they're extended over many years, and quite possibly not all that money is going to be spent. But even if it is, right, I think it's really, they're buying goodwill more than they are buying military equipment. I think they understand that.